Hello, and welcome to everyone joining us tonight for this live stream, and to all of you who are watching on demand. This is a Thane online event in celebration of the publication of Diane Abbott, the Authorized Biography. My name is Samara Linton. I am a doctor, author, and content creator. And joining me is Robin Bunce, a historian from Homerton College, University of Cambridge. And tonight we will be joined by the woman who needs no introduction, Diane Abbott, MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I've never had a biography published before, so this is all very exciting.
Thank you, Diane. So for everyone watching, in this hour-long event tonight, we're going to be speaking with Diane about the process of writing her biography, the research and interviewing, everything that went into it, our takeaways as authors, and also our highlights and anything interesting that came up along the way. So I'm going to be quiet now and let's get started to hear from Robin.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to begin simply by asking you, Diane, why it was in 2017 when you, in the autumn of 2017, when you received an email saying, would you be interested in having your biography written? I was wondering why it was then that you felt the time was right to engage in this project.
Well, I'm not sure whether the time was right, but I thought you were the right person. Actually written a rather good biography of Darcus Howe, the well-known activist who's since passed away. And I thought for a Cambridge Don, it was a very insightful and well-written biography, and you showed an understanding of Black politics and politics of race. So I thought you were somebody I wanted to work with. So I said yes.
Excellent. And I have to say, I was very surprised you did. I wasn't expecting the yes at all, but I thought, what's to lose? I might as well send the email. But yes, excellent. Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say so.
Thank you. And Robin, do you want to explain, I guess, how we ended up working together?
Oh, yes. You and I met in Cambridge, because obviously you were at Cambridge, I was at Cambridge. So we met, and I think we met during a period when you were the president of the Cambridge University Afro-Caribbean Society. And that society was doing some work called Black Cantabs, which was about Black people who had attended Cambridge University and kind of recovering the hidden or the lost history of the Black Cantabs. And obviously Diane was one of those Black Cantabs. So we began kind of discussing all kinds of things, including race, including kind of contemporary politics. So I did some research on the book for about 18 months. And at the moment when I finally got a contract, at the moment when I finally got a publisher to say yes, and at the moment where there was money on the table, I approached you and said, would you like to jump on board? Because we'd had these conversations, and I understood that you had recently published a book, and I understood that you were thinking of doing some more writing. So that was my way into it, and a lot of research. And then as soon as there was some money available, I thought I would reach out to you and see if you wanted to jump on board.
Yeah, so in terms of the process, by the time I joined, Robin, you'd already been doing lots of research, lots of interviews. You already met with Diane a few times. And then from then on, we did a mixture of, archival research, writing, transcribing, lots and lots of research. And Diane, I wanted to find out from you, kind of, how did you find the process of digging into your past, digging out all these old documents and photos and articles, and that kind of process of reflection and upheaval?
I will answer that, but I just wanted to ask Robin. He asked me why I wanted to have my biography written. Why did he want to write my biography?
That's a very good question. It's such a long time ago since I had the idea that it's kind of flown out of my head. I think essentially I felt that there was a story about British politics from the early 1980s all the way through to 2017, which had been ignored. And it's a story which begins with kind of black sections, and it's a story that travels through the GLC. And it's a story that you were at the center of. And when I think back over the last, 30 or 40 years, I was thinking, who has been the consistent voice for radical politics? And I thought, well, it's Diane Abbott. I thought, forgive me, I had literally never heard of Jeremy Corbyn before 2015. That's not entirely true, but he wasn't really on my radar. But Diane Abbott, you were on my radar, and so I always thought of you as the kind of champion for the left and the champion for radical politics. And I've always liked engaging with political figures who make an intelligent case. So I remember in the 2016 American presidential election, somebody said, well, the difference between Donald Trump is that he speaks in phrases and Hillary Clinton speaks in sentences. And I remember thinking about you, you speak in essays, you speak in, well-rounded, thought through, very coherent thoughts. So I've always liked listening to you speak, and I've always liked reading your writing, for the reason that you are articulating ideas in a very coherent way, which communicates complexity very clearly. So I guess those were my reasons for wanting to approach you when I did in 2017. And I remember the very first time I met you, and it shows a mistake on my part. I read from your body language that you were about to become Home Secretary. There was something about the way you walked into the room. I thought, there's a woman who will be, in the next 6 months, the Home Secretary of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Sadly, I misread your body language, but that was my first impression when I met you.
Well, to answer Samara's question, it was actually fascinating having a biography written. I thought, Robin offered, and I thought, well, he's thoughtful, he's got an interest in the politics of race and left politics, and he's the person. But he was very industrious about the research, and he dug up people and events that I'd actually forgotten about. So it was quite a fascinating process. But because I'm not a person that's me, I didn't think about it that much. I just tried to let Robin and yourself get on with it and make myself available when I could.
Yes, excellent. Was there anything in the research that we did which kind of stood out to you? Anything that we uncovered that you had forgotten about or surprised you?
Well, there wasn't anything that really surprised me. There was people and stuff I'd forgotten about, like when I was at school, even when I was at Cambridge. Because one of the things about my life, I've lived life at a really fast pace.
Yes.
People forget, but when I was a new member of Parliament would sit 3 or 4 days a week till 10 at night. So it was a very busy and all-consuming thing to be a member of Parliament. And also, I had my son in 1991. 4 years after I became a member of Parliament, I was a single mother. And being a single mother just on its own is a big thing. Being a single mother and being an MP in the days when Parliament's hours were so much longer and there were lots of big issues, the Maastricht Treaty, then as now Europe was a huge thing. It was just incredibly frantic. And so because I took things a day at a time, it was astonishing 30 years later to look back and reflect on some things.
And I suppose you've kind of partially answered this, but I kind of want to know what stood out to you from the book, because it wasn't, just your interviews and, research into what you've said. It was also a lot of other people that we spoke to, a lot of other people whose stories we recounted. Was there anything that was kind of maybe poignant or, stood out to you in terms of the people we spoke to or the themes that came up?
Well, I suppose my story is a story of the London left from the 80s to today. And so it was interesting to go back and read about stuff, the old GLC, Jeremy becoming leader. So it was interesting. It was interesting to relive a lot of stuff. No particular thing stood out.
Yeah.
How about you, Samara? Was there anything that stood out to you, when the book was completed, when you saw it, or anything that stood out to you in the process of writing?
Yeah, I think in the process of writing, the key things that stood out to me were just how you've been saying a lot of the same things for 30 years. And a lot of the issues that you've been campaigning about, a lot of the issues you've been raising in Parliament have been the same. And it's kind of that consistency was really, for me, very remarkable. And it's one of the main things I noticed when writing. But then I guess on the flip side, there was also, I guess, the kind of the more emotional side of just how familiar a lot of parts of your story felt, especially in your early years. Like my parents are Jamaican, I'm Jamaican. And just even like your stories of going to Jamaica for the first time, your stories of going to Cambridge as a Black woman, sadly, in many ways, I've related to a lot of your experiences, even though it's so many years later. But the familiarity of your experiences, it surprised me, but it was also quite, it gave me that kind of that warm feeling. It was nice to have, yeah. And yeah, Robin, you. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that we're in the era of Black Lives Matter, and a lot of people in all sorts of walks of life are talking about race as if they've never heard some of these issues before. But the sad thing is that a lot of these issues, whether it's education, whether it's policing, whether it's just Black people being able to get into the professions, some of us have been talking about these issues for at least 30 years. And it's a little bit surprising that people at the top of institutions are saying, oh gosh, we've never heard this before. They have heard it. They weren't prepared to pay attention before. So you have to give the Black Lives Matter people credit for forcing issues about race back on the agenda.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I was just going to ask Robin, because Robin and I have been having quite a few conversations about the fact that these issues come up time and time again, and you've, often been at the forefront of pushing them time and time again. And I know that was something that stood out to Robin as well. Is there anything else, Robin, that you've kind of found significant or kind of stood out to you as you were going through the book?
I think it's to kind of build on what Diane was saying about the way that the politics of race keeps re-emerging in the discussion in British political discussion, and the fact that, as Diane says, that we kind of are stuck in this loop of discussing the politics of race, of commissioning reports, and then not very much happening. And this seems to be a kind of, and I think if you look at the Black sections debates that were going on in the Labour Party between 1983 and 1987 or 1988 or whatever, you can see that there's a huge amount of confusion amongst the opponents of Black sections, and that confusion about the difference between, a colour conscious approach or a colour blind approach, that confusion is a confusion that I think is still very present in a lot of discussions of race, in the mainstream media today, and amongst the politicians who are currently part of our government. I think that confusion, when Boris Johnson is talking about statues being taken down or whatever, you can see that those kinds of confusions there as well. And about education, I mean, I didn't know a great deal about London schools and the Black child before I began writing this book. And I think one of the things that stood out to me was there was an event, I think it was probably in 2009, when Diane invited Boris Johnson to be one of the keynote speakers at London School and the Black Child. And Boris Johnson turns up and he makes this great speech about how he's 100% behind London Schools and the Black Child and how he's really looking forward to working with Diane in the future. And a year later, well, probably 6 months later, he cancels all contact with London Schools for the Black Child, commissions an entirely new report, which begins with the premise that race is not an issue, and then introduces a whole new framework for London schools, where London schools are not even supposed to measure how the spending of money impacts on race. So I think that stood out to me. Just one final thing, and that is a story which I don't think has ever been told before, and it's a story that I heard from Jonathan Aitken, And that is to say that in 1986 or maybe early 1987, the Speaker of the House of Commons called together senior people from the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, including Jonathan Aitken, and they all sat down and said, well, it looks like we're going to get some black people elected next time. How are we going to deal with this? So I thought that was interesting, and not least because in public, Conservative politicians were saying there is nothing new about having black people in Parliament. We've had black people before, which was a massive twisting of history out of shape. So in public, they were saying there's nothing interesting or unusual about black people being in Parliament, but in private, they recognised that there really was. So yeah, so there are all kinds of, I think, there are all kinds of interesting bits and pieces in the book. Well, I just hope the readers find them as interesting as I did.
It's interesting, Robin, when you say that the year before we all came in, the government, the Tory MPs met to say, how are we going to manage with these black people? Because it was very clear when the four of us became MPs that people were quite nervous of us. The then speaker was a man called Sir Bernard Weatherall, who was actually a perfectly nice man. And he went to a lot of trouble to try and manage us. I think the fear was that we would become like the Irish Republicans in the 18th century, when they got into Parliament and they caused all types of mayhem. A lot of the rules we now have in Parliament were as a consequence of the kinds of things that the Irish members did. So Bernard Weatherall, everyone was very nervous. They thought we would, be a bit crazy and wreck their institution. And Bernard Weatherall decided that Bernie Grant was the leader. So you would have Bernie up to his rooms for little chats, and he'd give Bernie port to drink. His idea was if he had his little chats with Bernie and poured port down his throat, we'd be more manageable and more amiable. But I'm talking about Bernard Weatherall, and you were talking about the Tories. A lot of Labour MPs were quite nervous about having black Labour MPs in Parliament for the first time, because bear in mind, we didn't get our seats because the party machine wanted us to get our seats. In almost every case, we had to fight the party machine. I remember, I don't know whether it's in the book, but I remember when I won Hackney North, the London region director said to me a few weeks later, in a pleasant way, not in a nice way, but he said to me, we had no idea that you would win. If we thought you would have won, we would have done something about it. That was kind of the attitude. How did this happen? I just remember going into Parliament for the first time and being with a group of Labour MPs, and them all kind of looking at me, part in fear and part in alarm. Looking back, it's easy to forget how startling and how alarming it was for Parliament as an institution to have black people in their midst.
On the subject of how Labour MPs responded to you, one of the things that really surprised me when I was doing the research was my conversation with Charles Clarke. Charles Clarke was one of very few people who were associated with the new Labour governments who was prepared to talk to me. And when I sat down with him, it was clear that he was going to give me both barrels, so to speak. So I'd expected him to be somewhat critical of you, but I'd expected that criticism to be, caveated and hedged to some extent, or you're finessed. But in reality, he just came straight out and had absolutely nothing good to say about you at all. And occasionally I invited him to kind of qualify his statements or to modify his statements. But he refused. He never, ever. He acknowledged that you were right about housing. He said, yes, you Labour didn't build enough houses. Diane was right about that. But on everything else, he just thought you were an unprincipled troublemaker. So I was wondering, when you read the account of what Charles Clarke said about you, were you surprised by that?
In one way, I was surprised at what Charles Clarke said, because English people tend to be more tactful and more nuanced, But I wasn't surprised at the sentiments behind it. those were the sentiments of New Labour all through the New Labour era, that kind of hostility. I was completely marginalised. Initially, when journalists wanted to have interviews with me, they were told, "Oh no, you can't have her, she won't turn up." So the hostility wasn't a shock. What was a shock is he would express it so bluntly. And then after about 10 years, and I started to do This Week. I mean, originally I was only doing This Week for, I don't know, couple of weeks. It was a temporary thing, but to everyone's surprise, to the producers and everyone's surprise, and to Michael Portillo and Andrew Neil's surprise, actually, it kind of gelled, and I ended up doing it for 12 years. So the response to the Labour Party establishment, and I've heard this occasionally recently, oh well, rather than go on to the front bench and work her way up, she chose to be this media personality. On the contrary, the chances of me getting any kind of position or role under New Labour were less than zero, and they know that. Just that they start to look a bit foolish now, the way they sought to marginalise me, that they try and make out that somehow it was my choice. I wasn't... as far as New Labour was concerned, I was a non-person, absolutely a non-person.
One of the things that, just coming in on that, one of the things that really interested me looking back at the 2010 leadership election was how fast that changed round. Because one of the things that amazed me was how David Miliband and Ed Balls and the others as well, how very quickly, once New Labour had lost the election in 2010, how quickly they were willing to speak out in public and make almost the very criticisms that you had made yourself of the New Labour government. So yeah, during the 2010 leadership election, it seemed very clear that the kinds of criticisms you had been making from the backbenchers were the kinds of things that fairly, reasonably independent-minded ministers in New Labour were thinking privately, but were not willing to say in public. And I kind of thought that was interesting in the sense that whilst Charles Clarke wanted to present you as an unprincipled troublemaker, there were people inside the New Labour government who actually agreed with you. They just weren't prepared to say it in public until New Labour had fallen, as it were.
Well, I think that's right. I also think that one of the aspects of the 2010 leadership election is that myself and Ed Balls and Ed Miliband and David Miliband and Andy Burnham, the four boys. My friends call them a boy band, actually. But boy band backing me. We did 52 meetings up and down the country in front of Labour Party members. And I think what the four guys saw and were slightly shocked by, I think, almost from the beginning, is how much the audiences responded to what I was saying. And they realised very quickly that the positions I'd taken for a long time were actually positions which had the support for ordinary Labour Party members. And they started to modify what they were saying. Noticeably, they went into that leadership election talking about immigration, saying that we had to listen to Labour support on immigration, blah, blah, blah. But when they realised that, that went down really badly with party members, you heard less about immigration in the course of that leadership campaign.
And I found it interesting that you were saying, in many ways you were forced into pursuing this kind of media career and this media personality, because I guess for me as a viewer, as a consumer, and someone who is from the world of politics, that's where we saw Diane the human and sort of Diane the politician. And I think that's where a lot of your popularity came from, for people seeing you for yourself instead of like through the prism of like Labour per se. And yeah, writing about your media life in terms of TV, radio, that kind of thing was probably one of my favourite parts of the writing process. And I wanted to ask you, do you have any standout moments from your years on TV? Anything you want to share with us?
Well, what I would say about all the media is, of course, I had worked in television, both Thames, which was then the London Regional station, and then TVAM, before I became an MP. So I settled into doing media reasonably easier because I wasn't intimidated by the cameras. And I remember even before I was doing This Week, television people would say to me that they liked interviewing me because when they interviewed like New Labour people, they would get the New Labour glaze. And the New Labour glaze was you ask them the first question, they got the answer to that. You ask them the second question, and they got the answer to that. You ask them the third question, they just glaze over because no one has told them the answer to that. And because I thought for myself, I always had an answer. What stood out? There's a few things that stood out, but they'd involve being rude about Andrew Neil, so I won't do it. But I must say, I did enjoy every week, once a week on a Thursday night, being able to talk about the week's politics. And I enjoyed that. And although I was, I wanted to run for leadership, I enjoyed it, I'm glad I did it. I don't regret doing This Week for 12 years. Although I think a lot of my Labour MP colleagues, maybe Charles Clarke, they were very bitter and twisted that I was on the television once a week and they weren't.
I remember people being quite bitter about the fact that you were on Come Dine With Me, even though that was a very enjoyable episode where you got all of your dinner guests quite drunk and rum punch. That was a standout for me. I just wanted to ask as well, because obviously a biography is, I guess it's quite research heavy, quite archive heavy, and you took a bit of a standoff approach in terms of letting Robin and I just kind of get on with the writing process. How would a Diane Abbott memoir differ from this biography, do you think?
Well, a Diane Abbott memoir would talk about my personal life in the way this biography doesn't. But because it was always meant to be a political biography, not, sort of a kind of Mills and Boon type thing, we haven't talked about my personal life at all. But I think my personal life has helped to form the person I've become. So I think an autobiography would deal with things that this biography didn't. But that doesn't make it a lesser book. I think that it's really great the way you've woven in my story with the story of the left from the 80s onwards.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say so. This book was, initially written for an audience of one, or maybe two, you and Belle Ribeiro Addy. So I'm glad that our initial audience is happy. On the subject of kind of you as a person and politics, and Samara and I have both been kind of making a kind of implicit distinction between those two, a personal aspect to your life and a political aspect to your life. I guess one area where those things intersect is political friendships. And it strikes me that, you've been friends with Jeremy Corbyn since the 1970s. You've been friends with Paul Boateng and Keith Vaz for almost as long. There seems to be a friendship between you and David Lammy, and obviously there's a close friendship between you and Shami Chakrabarti. And one of the things that I noticed as I was interviewing those people is that every single one of them, and obviously you've had political differences with Keith Vaz and Paul Boateng over the years, but in spite of those, there was a real warmth from them to you whilst I was interviewing them. And very much from Shami Chakrabarti and Jeremy and David Lammy as well. So I was wondering, in your mind, what role has friendship played in your political career?
Well, you know that Lyndon Baines Johnson, the US president, he had a saying, which I sometimes quote, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. But having said that, the friendships I have made have been very important because they've supported me through difficult times. Because even before I became Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Home Secretary, I was frequently a media target. And I remember being really distraught once, years ago now, and I can't even remember the media story, but there'd been a series of these stories, and I was really distraught, and I was thinking, I can't cope with this anymore. I'm going to step down. I cannot cope with this. Too much unpleasantness and untruths and so on. This was long before Jeremy Corbyn became leader. And I remember I rang Keith Vaz. Now, Keith Vaz had a difficult time in years, but we came into Parliament together and remained close. So I rang him and I was kind of saying, this is terrible, I'm going to step down, I can't take this anymore. And Keith said to me, very firmly, he said to me, no, Diane, you're not stepping down. You have forgotten what it took for us to get here. And you are not stepping down. You're going to do A, B, and C, and you're going to get through it. Never forgotten that.
And I remember when I spoke to Keith Vaz, he said to me, I'm still here, Robin. He said, I'm still here. And that in itself is an achievement. So yeah, no, I remember hearing Keith Vaz say that. One of the things that Keith Vaz and Paul Boateng and Bell Rabira Adi and Shami Chakrabarti really impressed on me was that this was an important project and it needed to be done well. And they all in different ways kind of gave me the look, which said, you need to do this well. And if you don't, there will be consequences, as it were. So I kind of felt that they were, they were reminding me. And Shami Chakrabarti did it very, very clearly. And I think I quote her on it in the book. Samara, how was your feeling about, how did you deal with the responsibility of the project?
Ooh, the responsibility. I think anyone who knows me personally will know that I was incredibly stressed when you asked me to be on the book, because I just felt, this is Diane Abbott, and this is a woman who has had such an extensive career and has been through so much, and often has had a very vindictive picture painted of her. And I knew that this book was going to have to kind of dig into those things, to unearth those things, to explore them, to challenge them. And it just felt like a very, very big task, a very big responsibility. But I've always been very interested in, Diane the person, more so than the history. I think that, Robin, that's your your love is the history. And I've always just been interested in the character and the person. And it felt like a really massive responsibility. And I think I stayed up talking to my family and my friends about it, asking my parents, do you think that this is something that I should take on, that I can do? And in the end, I'm really glad that I did, because I do believe that, there is a perspective that is offered when you have, especially because so much of the abuse directed at Diane has been racialized and sexualized. And I do think there was a benefit of having a Black woman writing and being part of that writing process. So I'm glad that I took part, I think, for that reason. But also, I think it's, the responsibility, it's a very weighty responsibility. And I think in a way, I'm glad that, Diane, you've just taken a step back and just let us get on with it, because I've just focused on presenting, I guess, the truth as I have interpreted it through, the information in front of me. And, I trust that I've done a good job with that, and I'm really proud of that. But there's also the knowledge that, people can use this to tell whichever story they want to tell, and use it and interpret it whichever way they want to interpret it. It's not something I take lightly. And I probably feel more stressed about it than I should, in terms of, the repercussions of the words that we've written there. This isn't just another biography, not at all. And I very much kind of held it with that respect. Yeah. What about you, Robin?
I really felt a responsibility to convey the power of Diane's speeches. So I remember when I first saw Diane's 1984 conference speech about Black sections. It's a very, very powerful piece of oratory, and I kind of felt I had to, one, convey the power of the oratory and the power of the argument, and two, to convey the context into which Diane made that intervention. And so, yes, I felt that, if any one of those bits, the context, the power of the oratory, the power of the argument, didn't work, then I would have failed to have conveyed that. And I think there are a number of things that you've written, a number of things that you have said, where all of those things needed to kind of fall into line in order for the sense of what you were saying to be intelligible to the reader. So yes, I think that was one of my concerns. Yes, I really very much felt that as a responsibility, and I did often have Shami Chakrabarty's words kind of, echoing in my ears when I was writing it. So yes, so I look forward to meet. I'm hoping I will one day get to meet Shami Chakrabarty again, and she can tell me whether I lived up to her expectations. Who knows? Yeah.
And there's also the responsibility of the message, because, because so many of these issues are still really prevalent and still really pertinent, that even in recapping, debates from the 90s, I felt like there was a responsibility to make sure those arguments were still made with the same vigor that they were made then, because unfortunately, so many of them are still relevant today. And I think I was very aware of that. I guess a lot has happened in a couple of years since we've been writing this book. The world is a very interesting place, and it's kind of brought to mind the necessity of a lot of the issues that have been covered in the book. So I think there's also that kind of that present weight attached to it as well. Yeah. And I guess, Diane, what did you? Because I met you kind of towards the latter part of the interviewing process, and by that point Robin had already done lots of interviews with you and a lot of research. I guess, what did you expect or hope for when you agreed to this? I know you just said Robin was very thorough, but did you have any expectations or hopes when we embarked on this project?
Well, I've been a journalist, a television journalist, before I became a member of Parliament. And I do feel that journalists, proper journalists, are entitled to have freedom to write what they think. Obviously, now the type of journalism you get, the sort of people that, were attacking Jeremy and myself and others in one thing. But in principle, one of the reasons I stood back, that my friends were trying to beat you around the head and saying you better make sure it's okay. But one of the reasons I stood back is I think that it's important that you looked at the facts, spoke to people, and wrote your own book. And I didn't feel that I had anything in my personal life to be ashamed of. I didn't think there was anything to hide or anything I wanted to boost. I was just content to let the facts speak for themselves. And Samara, you're right. People who are anti-Diana, but people will take lines out of the book at random and use them to make whatever case they want to make. There's an American police show, American cop show, I've forgotten the name, but one of the kind of lead characters in it had a sort of line, and his line was, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts." So what did I expect? Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
I like it.
So Diane, what's next for you? What does the future hold for you?
Well, there was a point when I thought I might be the next Home Secretary, but that's not going to happen now. I suppose. I've had consistent themes, consistent concerns all my adult life, from my teens really: social justice, racial justice, feminism, and internationalism as well, actually. And I just want to continue to work and campaign on those issues. And for whatever platform I have, whether it's in House of Commons or whether it's elsewhere, I just want to continue to work on those issues, because I didn't become interested in racial justice because it was a way of becoming an MP. I became an MP because I wanted to do things about racial justice, and I'll continue to do those, both from the backbenches, because I was on the backbenches a long time and I enjoyed it. It's fine, you know. I didn't plan to go on the front bench. I mean, having been frozen out completely by New Labour, I wasn't planning to go on the front bench. And you can be more effective on the backbenches because you're free to say what you really think. So I'll continue to say what I really think from the backbenches. Yeah.
And I guess kind of a follow-up question in that what's very, very clear from the book is that you have inspired a new generation of MPs. You know, there are so many young and new MPs who will directly point to you and say that, you know, because of you, they are there. I just kind of wanted to know, what kind of relationship do you have with new MPs? What kind of hopes do you have for them? What would you say maybe to young people who are maybe watching this and are, you know, aspiring to work either in politics or in justice, or, you know, what would you say to those people?
Well, when I was first elected to Parliament, for 10 years, I was the only black woman MP. And then for maybe another 10 years, it was me and somebody else. First of all, it was Una, and then it was Dawn. I'm very, very proud that there's so many more young black women MPs now. I mean, they mostly came in actually over the period when Jeremy was leader, because, you know, the leader of the party has some involvement in selections. And I'm very, very proud. Now, not all of them believe in every single thing that I believe in, but when I was on the front bench and I'd look behind me and I'd see all these black women and I think, wow, and I was really excited because I'd spent 30 years in Parliament as the only black woman, and suddenly you've got all these young black women. And, you know, I don't agree with them on everything, they don't agree with me on everything, but it's so important to have that level of representation. And I just think I think most of them come into being an MP from slightly different routes. But I think the fact that you've got so many of them there now shows a couple of things. It shows that you can get through if you want to get through, if you're really determined, but it also shows how important it is in almost any walk of life to not just think about your own career and your own profile, but what you can do to make it possible for other people that look like you to climb the ladder behind you. And I hope that's what I've done.
Thank you.
One of the things that I always saw when I was coming to visit you in Portcullis House is on the first floor, there is a painting of the House of Commons in 1986. So the year before you arrived, and it is extraordinary. It's just such a reminder that it was male dominated and entirely white. So yeah, and it's there, you know, just underneath your office. And I used to see it every time. So that was always a reminder to me of how much you had done by your example and by making the arguments you did to change British politics. So yes, no, absolutely. Samara, did you have any kind of final thoughts?
No, I think it's just, I'm excited to see what other people think of the book, excited to see everyone's feedback. I mean, I've really enjoyed writing it and I'm going to enjoy reading it again and again. And we've got a great photo section in the middle with showcasing, you know, some photos, some great points in your life. So it's been a really enjoyable process. It's been a privilege. And it's one that I'll definitely carry with me. So thank you, Diane, for sharing, you know, your life with us and allowing us to document it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great fun working with you.
And it's been great working with both of you.
It's very kind of you to say so. Well, thank you to everyone who's joined us. I'm hoping that invitations were sent out to lots of your school friends, Diane, and in fact, your old school history teacher, Anne West. I'm hoping that they were able to join us tonight. And if not, that they'll be able to watch this back over the next 48 hours. I want to say thank you to Mia Morris for, I think this was her brainchild, and thank you for all the work she did to make this happen. And thank you to the Black Cultural Archives, not least because the Black Cultural Archives were just a fantastic resource to rely upon and to use whilst writing this book.
Yeah, and thank you to Juanita for all your support in putting this together. You know, this wouldn't be possible without you. And to everyone who's buying the book and supporting and sharing, you know, this is part of our history. So yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.